I have never stood in front of fireworks before. This is splendid, and you know, who knows where it's going to go from here. I'm John Orlock. I'm the interim director of the Baker-Nord Center for the Humanities, and it is fabulous to see you here this evening. I mean, just fabulous. And by you, I mean students, architects, interested members of the community, faculty. It's just, it's what makes this event such a special one for the year. And I'm glad you're all here to share in what I expect will be an extraordinary evening. And tonight's Richard and Campen lecture in architecture and sculpture is the latest in a series of our programming that centers around the theme of fame, celebrity, and the concept of genius. And the Baker-Nord Center here on campus, for those of you who may not be familiar with this, is the focal point where scholarship is not only developed, but it's promulgated, it's encouraged among faculty, students, and the community. And this year we've had so far in our programming Lydia Davis, a renowned translator of French, a very fine recent translator of Proust. Last week, Griel Marcus was here, a culture critic, in conjunction with the Cleveland Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. And we've had also a Shakespeare Film Festival in conjunction with Cinematex. And this is what, someone asked me this evening, what is it that Baker-Nord does? This is what Baker-Nord does, filling the ballroom and twing. This is really, and this is what Baker-Nord, this is the eye. There will be another brochure just like this, so that if you get this, and there aren't many left, so that we may have to see these on eBay soon. And because if you have this eye, the spring brochure will offer you this eye. Really, this is design, what can I say? You know, and you can hang them both on your refrigerator and have the eyes of Baker-Nord upon you, even when it's not the season. This evening, in addition to this, in a few weeks we'll have a faculty works in progress. Jeffrey Ullum of the theater faculty will be presenting his recent research on a book that he's putting together on the history of the Cleveland Playhouse. So this is something that many of you might also be interested in. And how will you know about this if you don't have your brochure? What you will do is, as you rise to leave, under your seat will be this yellow piece of paper that is our feedback sheet. This is important because this tells us who you are, why you are here, and how we can contact you should you have more interest. Also, beyond that interest, and it's my pleasure to welcome this evening, is the Friends of Baker-Nord, who help us carry through with the programming here on campus and beyond. And back, at least they were backed by the food table. They were the opportunity to become a friend of Baker-Nord brochure. So on the way out, please take a look at that. Also in line for thanks are the residents of Cuyahoga County for their support for this event through a generous public grant from the Cuyahoga Arts and Culture Council. And along the list of welcoming to the School of Architecture alumni here at Case Western Reserve University, a number of whom have joined us. And also here are two past Campen lecturers, Robert Madison and Peter Van Dyke, in our audience with us this evening. These lectures are made possible through the generosity of Richard N. Campen, a chemist, who along the way developed an abiding interest in architecture and wrote 10 books on the subject. And several members of the Campen family are with us here this evening. Richard Campen, son of Richard N. Campen and his wife, Margareta, and Peter Campen, grandson of Richard N. Campen and his wife, Reagan. And if we may offer them some applause for their generosity. I grew up in Philadelphia as a way of coming into this. And in 4th grade, we had a teacher, Bessie Sungard, Mrs. Sungard, who would sit out in recess with her watercolors, and she would paint. And she would tell us about art. And that was the first time in Mrs. Sungard's class in the Philadelphia Public Schools where we heard the word architecture. And the two things that she said, and this one she said over and over again, that no building can be built in Philadelphia that is taller than the top of William Penn's hat, which is a huge statue in the top of City Hall in downtown Philadelphia. And she, for whatever reason, sometimes just 3 or 4 times in the school year, this would come up and just say, you know, class, no building can be built in Philadelphia that's taller than William Penn's hat. That was my introduction. And along, she also, periodically through the semester, had this other phrase that would come up, and here again, I have no knowledge why, but she would say, and downtown Philadelphia, for those of you who are going to Gimbel's, you will see the PSFS building, which is a very famous building and is in many fine art books. This was her criteria, and we as a class knew nothing more than that, than to go downtown, get off the Yale, and there's the PSFS building at the center of the Philadelphia urban architecture. And this evening, we are re-entering urban architecture from a very different door, in a very different age, with our lecture by Blair Kamin. Blair Kamin is the Pulitzer Prize-winning architecture critic of the Chicago Tribune, a post he has held since 1992. He also serves as a contributing editor of the Architectural Record. He won the Pulitzer Prize for Criticism in 1999 for a body of work highlighted by a series of articles about the problems and promise of Chicago's greatest public space, its lakefront. I'll point a special note to this audience here this evening, I might add, who has a lakefront of its own. And he has received numerous other honors and authored books and lectured widely. Published in 1998, Kamin's 6-part series, Reinventing the Lakefront, shed light on numerous problems along the city's shoreline, such as the disparity between lakefront parks bordered on by largely white and affluent neighborhood areas on Chicago's north side, and those lined by black and poor neighborhoods on the city's south side. Following the publication of the deeply reported essays, Mayor Richard M. Daley and the Chicago Park District authorized comprehensive plans of 4 of Chicago's 7 lakefront parks, an area of nearly 2,000 acres, and more than 10 miles of shoreline. In addition, the city altered its plan for a former U.S. Steel site on the far south lakefront, bringing the total area affected by the series to almost 2,500 acres and 12 miles of shoreline. Kamin's Pulitzer Prize citation praised his lucid coverage of city architecture. In addition to the Pulitzer, Kamin is the recipient of more than 30 awards. Among his other honors are the George Polk Award for Criticism, the American Institute of Architects Institute Honor of Collaborative Achievement, and the AIA's Presidential Citation conferring 2004 was part of the collaborative, Kamin was part of the collaborative team that won the 2003 National Magazine Award for General Excellence for the Architectural Record. So for this evening's Campen lecture on architecture and sculpture, join me and Bessie Sungard, 4th grade, Philadelphia, to welcome Blair Kamin.
Well, thank you so much for that passionate, intelligent welcome. It's really a delight to be here, particularly in this room. I have never lectured in a ballroom before. If I had known I was lecturing in a ballroom, I would have worn white tie and tails, but you'll have to pardon my suit. I really want to thank the Baker Nord Center for the Humanities for inviting me to give this talk, and I want to thank the Campen family for sponsoring it. It's really a delight for me to be back here at Case Western, particularly because one of my college roommates, Professor Daniel Cohen, is on your faculty. He has agreed not to tell any incriminating stories about me until afterwards. So I want to begin tonight by asking for a show of hands. And how many of you have taken the famous architectural boat tour down the Chicago River? Okay, fair amount, maybe a quarter or a third. Okay. Well, tonight I want to take you on a very different sort of architectural tour, and it's one that I think is timely in light of the recently concluded 10th anniversary of the September 11th terrorist attacks, as well as the recent end of Mayor Richard Daley's 22-year reign in Chicago, running City Hall. This tour really gives us a chance to look back on an era of striking buildings and cataclysmic events, and to ask some simple but searching questions. What did we do right? Where did we go wrong? How can we do better next time? And in light of the Baker Nord Center's year-long exploration of the theme, celebrity, fame, and the concept of genius, we can also ask, what role did celebrity architects and developers play in this story? What sort of legacy have they left, both on this campus and around the nation? The obvious place to start the story was not on 9/11, but rather with the dawn of the millennium, which I'm representing here with this slide of the fireworks in the Sydney Harbor. And you can see the Sydney Opera House, and the frivolity of the moment is symbolized by that goofy smile on the Harbor Bridge. But I think it's fair to say that in retrospect, if the dawn of the millennium marked the turning of the pages of a calendar, September 11th marked a turning point in our history. From it came wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, a major ratcheting up of security at our airports and in our government buildings. So September 11th really forms the first bracket of the story. Now, at first glance, the other bracket should be one of the days that you saw in the video, September 15th, 2008. That was when Lehman Brothers declared bankruptcy and precipitated a widespread financial meltdown. And you can see I'm symbolizing that here with this slide. This is the kind of image that newspapers always run when the stock market tanks. You can see the trader with this incredibly concerned look on his face. You can see the screen behind him charting the market's downward path. That could also be the trader's EKG. It's probably about to flatline any second. The point is that even after the banks stopped making loans and construction activity, for the most part, jerked to a halt in the fall of 2008, a few other large-scale projects had enough momentum to stagger to the finish line. And this was one of them, the Burj Khalifa, which you saw at the end of the video, the final outsized flourish of the age of excess. And when I mean outsized. This skyscraper is half a mile high. It is the Empire State Building ×2 with room to spare. This is a building that was conceived amid the exuberance of one era and that opened amid the real estate collapse of another. Now, to me, one of the fascinating things about piecing together this story between the two brackets was to see both what happened and what didn't happen in the time in between. For example, after the shock of the September 11th terrorist attacks, opinion leaders such as Graydon Carter, the editor of Vanity Fair magazine, portentously declared what they called the end of irony. Well, the end of irony lasted about a week. Soon after, Graydon Carter was forced to declare that he hadn't really meant the end of irony, he had really meant the end of ironing. Well, just as irony declined to die, so the skyscraper did not succumb to the terrorist threat, as many had predicted that it would. Instead, as the fear from the attacks ebbed, the world experienced the greatest skyscraper building boom in its history, with more towers rising to a greater height in a wider variety of places and with greater formal invention than ever before. There was this building, Rem Koolhaas's CCTV headquarters in Beijing, with that giant and somewhat menacing arch, thumbing its nose at conventional skyscraper verticality. In Dubai, as I've told you, there was the Burj Khalifa, rising an astonishing half-mile, 2,717 feet to be specific, above the desert floor. Writing from afar, some critics have labeled this building the Hummer of skyscrapers. Having seen it in person, I actually considered it an elegantly proportioned and exquisitely detailed answer to Dubai's rather preposterous collection of architectural cartoons. In Chicago, there was the Aqua Building by a rising star, Jeannie Gang. Its undulating balconies brought the samba elan of Brazil and the great Brazilian architect Oscar Niemeyer to our rather sober Miesian city of endless grids and rectangles. The point is that only a real estate bust, not Osama bin Laden, could stop this skyscraper. But there was no denying the impact of the terrorist attacks on our architecture and the shape of our cities. Indeed, I think it's fair to say that the most unforgettable and consequential architectural stories of the first decade of the 21st century were not about great feats of construction, rather, they were about spectacular acts of destruction. The attack on the Twin Towers and the devastation wrought by Hurricane Katrina played out in real time, and they riveted and unsettled the millions who watched them. Both not only did violence to their victims and their cities, they did violence to our internal gyroscopes, disrupting the very structures and urban networks, streets in the middle of New Orleans that we count upon to bring order to the chaos of daily life. Both, in a way, were examples of a key theme of this era, which is spectacle. Very important word for this 10-year period. The dictionary defines spectacle as a dazzling display, something remarkable to be seen or viewed, especially at a large scale. And when we think of spectacle, we usually think of something like this, something uplifting, like the 4th of July fireworks. As this Time magazine cover plainly shows, though, the attack on the Trade Center represented a twisted, fiendish variation on the theme of spectacle. The terrorists pointedly did not kill nearly 3,000 people by quietly poisoning our drinking water. Instead, they went after our buildings, and in the most spectacular form of destruction imaginable. In doing so, they induced a fear so deep that it led to more damage that we inflicted upon ourselves. Consider how much our experience at the airport has changed. What I'm showing you here is a model, an architectural model of the architect Helmut Jahn's design for the United Airlines terminal at O'Hare International Airport in Chicago. I suspect that many of you have been through this building changing planes to go to another destination. You can see from this model what Jahn had in mind, a series of barrel vaults at the gates that evoke the great railroad terminals at the turn of the last century. In this scheme, security clearly was not a priority. And you can see that really more clearly in this slide, which shows the entry sequence. On your right, you see what were called at the time flow-through ticket counters, okay? The idea was that you would go to these little gates, you would check in, and then you would go to those tiny little security stations right behind them, on the left of the image. And then you would enter into the barrel-vaulted expanse of the concourse. This was all going to be one big, happy architectural greenhouse. It would be open, expansive, and relaxed, and the transition from curbside to gate was supposed to take about 60 seconds. Okay, well, as all of you know, the reality has become entirely different. The flow-through ticket counter has now been replaced by what I call the fortress ticket counter. Stark walls block the view into the terminal and the view of the barrel-vaulted concourse. Guard dogs patrol the tightly controlled counters, and it can take 20 minutes, not 1 minute, to go through the security zone. The whole experience is stress-filled, not relaxing, confining rather than expansive. So the architecture of fear has turned Jan's design completely on its head. And as all of you know, I think, this is hardly the only place where fear has become a governing factor in the cityscape. When Daniel Libeskind won the design competition for Ground Zero, his master plan called for a vibrant new urban district, a new Rockefeller Center anchored not by a sunken skating rink, but by a sunken memorial to the nearly 3,000 people who died in the attacks. But this is what we are getting instead. David Child's One World Trade Center and its nearly windowless 20-story base, which has been shaped to combat police fears that a vehicle-delivered bomb could kill scores of people with flying glass. This is what some critics have called militarized urbanism, and it sends a very mixed message. We will keep on building to the sky, but the skyscrapers we do build will have a chilling impact on the street. In Chicago after 9/11, the fortress architecture virus even spread to such landmarks as Burnham and Ruth's Rookery building on LaSalle Street. There, the building's managers closed off this space, the greenhouse-like light court at the building's heart. They claimed that their tenants were expressing concern about the presence of visitors, like, say, this incredibly dangerous-looking architectural tour group. But the architecture of fear didn't achieve a wholesale triumph. As after 9/11, some predicted that the terrorist attacks would drive us into the safety and sanctuary of our homes in a trend that pop culture experts called cocooning. But 3 years after 9/11, we witnessed the triumphant restoration of the public realm in Chicago's Millennium Park. Yes, it did open 4 years after the millennium, and yes, it did cost 3 times its original price tag. But its troubles were quickly forgotten once it dazzled us with interactive public sculptures like Jaume Plensa's Crown Fountain and Anish Kapoor's Cloud Gate. If cocooning separated us in our living rooms, Millennium Park gathered us in a great urban living room, a shared public space. So just as the skyscraper survived the terrorist attacks, so did our deeply felt desire to gather in spaces where we might find common ground as well as common humanity with those different from ourselves. Now, what we also saw in these years was a spectacular explosion of construction, especially in Chicago. In the 10 years ending in 2008, developers in Chicago started or completed nearly 200 high-rises, 200. That is roughly twice as many high-rises as there are in all of downtown Milwaukee. Now, skyscrapers have traditionally been office buildings, but as you know, this was primarily a surge of residential buildings, specifically apartment and condominium high-rises. And their presence reflected how new cultural attractions like Millennium Park had changed perceptions of the once gritty loop. Now we come to celebrity. The ultimate example of this trend is Donald Trump's 92-story hotel and condominium tower along the Chicago River. Now, say what you will about his Trump, his taste, and his hair. He is a master of manipulating the media, a modern P.T. Barnum. In 2004, all the publicity generated by The Apprentice, his reality TV show, helped Trump attract condominium buyers. And that, in turn, persuaded banks to finance his Chicago skyscraper. Now, in reality, the grinning fellow with the thumb up, pictured here alongside Trump, this is Bill Rancic, the winner of The Apprentice, served really no apprenticeship on this project. I mean, he had about as much to do with Trump's Chicago skyscraper as I had to do with the building of Terminal Tower. But the show, as we know now, with the benefit of 2020 hindsight, was a giant publicity vehicle for advancing the Trump brand in general and the Trump Chicago skyscraper in particular. But that, in a way, is getting ahead of the story. So that's 2004. I just want to go back to the morning of September 11th, 2001. On that morning, I thought I had what we in the journalism trade called a scoop, an exclusive. I had turned up this rendering of a design that Trump had considered for his riverfront skyscraper. As you can see, it was a pencil-thin tower, about 2,000 feet tall, exactly what you'd expect from a developer who never had met a world's tallest building plan he didn't like. Unfortunately, that scoop became utterly meaningless when the jets crashed into the trade towers. And with fear thick in the air, Trump took this 2,000-foot building, kept all of its square footage in place, and squashed it down to this, a building that was only about 1,100 feet tall. This was one of the worst skyscraper designs I have ever seen. In the pages of the Chicago Tribune, I ripped it as a bloated blob of a skyscraper that was completely unworthy of a site near the Chicago Tribune Tower, the Wrigley Building, and the other great 1920 skyscrapers around the Michigan Avenue Bridge. Trump and his architect, Adrian Smith, got the message, and eventually the tower got taller and better. It has an elegant steel and glass curtain wall that compensates for its enormous bulk and disappointing spire. It's certainly better than anything we ever expected to get from Donald Trump. Now, the second great skyscraper saga of these years, the story of the Chicago Spire, probably needs no introduction. The architect Santiago Calatrava's original design, which you see here, called for each successive scallop-shaped floor plate to rotate a few degrees over the one below it. Calatrava's idea was to create the illusion that the tower was twisting as it lifted into the sky. A few years later, after the original developer couldn't make a go of it, we got this design, which was Spire version 2.0. It had 3 times as many condominiums as the original, but it was still very twisty and even more phallic. And now, of course, as you saw in the video, it's come to this very embarrassing hole in the ground. Now, I have a blog, which is called Cityscapes, and one of the great things about the blog is that you get to interact with your readers. So I asked the readers of the blog, what would you do with the Chicago Spire hole? And I got some wonderful responses from them. My favorite was to put all of Illinois' corrupt politicians in there, fill the hole with cement. Another was to make it the world's largest compost heap. The third best was to make it the site of the future Obama presidential library, since the hole, after all, is shaped like the letter O. All right, not all the blog humor is good, I'll admit. People complain that the Spire hole is an eyesore, but I think it's fair to say that the real eyesores left by the building boom were some of the high-rises that actually got built. This is one of my favorite examples, a monolithic slab called One Superior Place. I think it's fair to say that it looks like it was designed by a refugee from East Berlin. Now, part of the problem comes from the fact that these residential towers have huge parking garages, podiums or bases they're called, below their living quarters. And some of these garages are 10 to 12 stories high, which is actually taller than the first skyscraper that was built in Chicago. This is really kind of a suburbanization of this very urban building type. As you see here in this tower in the center, this really creates a problem for architects. It creates a very awkward set of proportions. Many of the towers look like this one does, kind of like a man with his pants hiked up too high. Mediocre architects really struggled with these bases, or podiums as they're called. This one, as you can see, is decorated with pieces of metal that resemble potato chips. I've often thought that there was a naming opportunity here for Frito-Lay. They should just pay Red Lobster to get rid of the building, and they should call it the Frito-Lay building instead. Well, everybody, even Mayor Daley, hated all these skyscrapers, even though, of course, Mayor Daley's planners had approved them. So in 2005, King Rich, as we like to call him, made his famous "No More Ugly Buildings" proclamation. And in turn, terrified architects tried other gimmicks, like they turned their towers into giant tic-tac-toe boards. Or they dolled up their garages with their parking garage podiums. You can see the podium I'm here talking about here is at the bottom. I think you can see it. It has fake Victorian windows, fake shutters, fake flower boxes. All that's really missing from these stage set designs are curtains in the windows and fake little people, fake little Victorian people to create the illusion that the garage was somehow occupied people from the Victorian age rather than cars and SUVs. So as these eyesores show, the building boom was really very much a mixed blessing. And even such mundane structures as the small branch banks that multiplied wildly during these years were part of this sorry trend. Now, a bank, as all of you know, Cleveland has some very beautiful bank buildings, once looked like this. It looked like a Roman temple. The banker played the secular priest. He dispensed loans instead of benedictions. Louis Sullivan once said, in buildings like this, bankers should wear togas, not suits. But now, as you can see from this Washington Mutual stuffed into the bottom of a parking garage, a bank really looks more like a Rite Aid convenience store. In London, St. Paul's Church, the epitaph of Sir Christopher Wren famously reads, "If you would seek his monument, look around you." But on this architectural tour, as you can sadly see, our architectural and urban planning mistakes are all around us. Now, there was another kind of building boom in these years, a cultural building boom in which star architects turned out structures that more easily fit the definition of spectacle. Invariably, the architects of these buildings were celebrities, or so-called starchitects, very ungainly coinage. And like Oprah, they could all be recognized by one name, Frank, Zaha, Danielle, Rem. Their clients wanted them to create icons, a word that took on an entirely different meaning than the religious works of art of the Eastern Orthodox Church. As this ad for the Aqua skyscraper shows, today's icons are principally venerated for their eye-catching and easily marketable forms. They're more about mammon than God, more about the sales job than spirituality. As Aqua attests, the icons that the starchitects have given us are invariably neo-Baroque affairs. They're full of dynamic, curving lines, fluidity in motion, and explosive, expressionistic energy. Perhaps the best way to understand what iconic architecture is to see what it is not. And a good example is the contained classicism of the original Art Institute of Chicago, which I'm showing you here. As you can see, it's perfectly symmetrical, reserved to the point of austerity. You feel the weight of its stone. It seems as permanent and as fixed in place as an ancient Greek or Roman temple. Well, not so the icon buildings. In Calatrava's crowd-pleasing addition to the Milwaukee Art Museum, as you saw in the video, the sunshade over the entry hall isn't fixed. It moves amazingly. The building isn't contained. It seems like it's exploding into the sky. The design isn't chaste, like the Art Institute. It's flamboyant. It doesn't express gravity. It defies gravity. It's iconic, individual, special, a one-off. In other words, it's genius architecture. And the implicit message is that only a star architect could have created it. Now, as Frank Lloyd Wright's Guggenheim in New York shows, we have had iconic buildings and genius architects before. But Frank Gehry's Guggenheim and the so-called Bilbao effect set off a virtual stampede of clients intent upon creating Bilbao effects of their own. It happened at museums, it happened in concert halls, and as you know, it happened in universities. And the outcomes varied widely from place to place. So you're probably wondering what I think about the Peter B. Lewis building. And here's what I would say, having reviewed it 9 years ago and having walked through it today. It has a spatially stupendous interior, and I love that part of the building. It seems to encourage the sort of serendipitous meetings among students and faculty that Frank Gehry intended. But this was a yes-but review. The building is nonetheless a mountain of metal with far too much architectural firepower. It's a foreground building on a background site, and of course, as you all know, there is a problem with falling snow and ice that the guy from California didn't take into effect. We have that in Chicago too. We have a bridge that Frank designed, and it has a beautiful wood deck, and when it snows in the winter, the snowplows can't go over it, so they just have to close the bridge. In Milwaukee, Calatrava's low-slung white addition seems far better suited to its expansive shoreline site than the Lewis building does to its tightly confined urban site. Whether the Milwaukee addition evokes a bird or a ship's mast really matters less than the way it's given its gritty city an exuberant new urban symbol. The exquisitely sculpted ribs of Calatrava's corridor galleries are a structural delight and defy the charge that the museum is nothing more than an attention-getting shape. In Los Angeles, another iconic building, Frank Gehry's masterful Walt Disney Concert Hall, channels the chaotic, sprawling forces of that city and transforms them into an extraordinary celebration of community. Inside is this curvaceous, wood-paneled auditorium, really one of the finest rooms in America. It resembles a great arc, suggesting with its seating arrangement and design that somehow, despite our differences, we're all in the same boat. Yet this push for iconic architecture could get as overheated and as irrationally exuberant as the pre-crash stock market. In Denver, Daniel Libeskind's addition to that city's art museum offers a startling, over-the-top piece of architectural sculpture, which you can see here with its tilting cubes and razor-sharp prow. Yet this is what all those visual pyrotechnics get you on the inside, which is quite simply a curator's nightmare. Hanging paintings and sculpture on these tilting walls required the museum to actually build straight walls on top of the diagonal ones. Not exactly a clear instance of form-following function. Indeed, here, the quest for novel form really superseded the need for workable art display space. Invariably, this push for instant icons was so pervasive that it led to a counter-movement which prized subtlety over spectacle. You can see this new sobriety in the calm, classicizing modernism of Renzo Piano's Modern Wing at the Art Institute. Here, the architecture does not overwhelm the art as it does in Libeskind's Denver Art Museum edition. Here, the architectural container and the art it contains are in perfect balance. Natural light seeps through the vellum ceilings, and filtered views of the skyline of Chicago form an enlivening backdrop. However they turned out, though, spectacular or subtle, far too many of these ambitious cultural buildings saddled their institutions with financial burdens that proved difficult to bear. Anticipated crowds did not materialize. Gift shops did not prosper. Staff had to be laid off, and hours had to be cut. This building, Stephen Hall's addition to the Nelson Atkins Museum in Kansas City, their cost-cutting literally dimmed the beauty of the addition's proudest feature. These pavilions are lenses that draw daylight into the galleries and shine like jewels at night. To save money after the crash of 2008, the museum shortened the lens's poetic display of light by 14 hours per week. If you built it, in other words, they didn't necessarily come. Yet beneath the surface of the glittery museums and the striking high-rises of these years, a countervailing force was gathering, a new push for sustainability, a word that once simply meant capable of being sustained, but increasingly took on ecological overtones, and appropriately so, given that buildings generate an estimated 40% of the greenhouse gases in the United States. One unlikely figure personified this trend, Chicago's former mayor, who was seen here at a press conference in which, appropriately, his chief prop is a rooftop solar panel. Now, when Mayor Daley began his beautification push in the early 1990s, I characterized him as Mayor Martha Stewart. He dolled up the cityscape with features like the flower-filled median planters in the middle of Michigan Avenue. And then, in 2003, Daley took a page from the playbook of Robert Moses and ordered a middle-of-the-night shutdown of a small lakefront airport, much like your Burke Airport here. In doing so, Daley ordered this shutdown so he could turn this airport into a park, something that I would strongly recommend would happen at your lakefront airport, but that's another issue. In doing this, Daley revealed that he would use the power of his iron fist to enforce the preferences of his green thumb. Now, I didn't really approve of the way that Daley did this. It was completely autocratic and undemocratic, but I do have to say that I did approve of the manner in which the shutdown was carried out. The backhoes, as you can see, carved giant X's in the runway at the former Meigs Field, and in my eyes, at least, this was very much in keeping with the vernacular of Chicago architecture, the structurally expressive vernacular of our X-braced John Hancock building. I mean, it was easy to imagine in the war room at City Hall discussing what the backhoe should do. Should they form circles in the runway? Should they form squares in the runway? I'm sure that ultimately they thought of the architecture of Chicago, that's the core of our city, and they decided upon X's, which was very appropriate. I really do miss Daley, even if I often took him to task in print. He was a great mayor with a true passion for his city, and he did have a profound and largely positive impact on the cityscape. During his reign, Chicago added more than 1,300 acres of open space, as seen in the reconstruction of Wacker Drive along the Chicago River, and it made possible a new people-friendly stretch of Riverwalk. Following the example, the green roof that the mayor had installed atop our City Hall 11 years ago, the City of Chicago and private developers have built more than 7 million square feet of planted roofs, which is more than any other city in America. To a startling degree, Daley's evolution parallels the one we've seen in the country as a whole. At the dawn of the millennium, green architecture was for people who wore Birkenstocks. But by the end of the decade, green buildings were happening more and more. 2 years ago, for example, a wealthy Chicago man moved into this building. This is Chicago's first net zero house. It's designed to produce as much energy as it consumes. You can see the butterfly-shaped roofs it has. They hide the solar array that produces much of the building's energy. In another sign of green architecture's popular appeal, crafty developers flaunted their building's sustainable credentials as a marketing tool, while in some cases environmental awareness devolved into greenwashing. That's an exaggeration of a building's green credentials. This is one of my favorite examples of that. This is a showcase McDonald's in downtown Chicago that takes the original design of Ray Kroc's McDonald's in Des Plaines, Illinois, and blows it up to steroid size. On the roof of this building, a small portion of the roof is actually a green roof with some grass and shrubs. I would argue, though, that putting grass and shrubs atop such a symbol of the energy-wasting car culture is a little bit like slapping a thin piece of lettuce on a bacon double cheeseburger and calling it healthy. Barack Obama's election to the White House gave sustainability a bigger boost as the ambitious stimulus package funded rehabs to weatherize modest income homes and to make federal buildings like the one here in Cleveland more energy efficient and perhaps more beautiful. Yet the stimulus package has been a disappointment in many ways. It hasn't produced great public works like the Hoover Dam. It hasn't even produced modest public works like Skidmore, Owings and Merrill's handsome underground commuter railroad station beneath Millennium Park. Instead, the first year of stimulus spending was largely devoted to quick fixes like repairing roads. Worse, Obama's infrastructure plans continue to be under attack from the Tea Party, which argues that the government can't cut spending and build a better future at the same time. To me, at least, these people are incredibly short-sighted. If the nation had followed their one-dimensional logic in the 1930s, the New Deal wouldn't have built the graceful Art Moderne Lakeshore Drive Bridge in Chicago, or the even more impressive Art Moderne Arcade atop the infamous grassy knoll at Dallas's Dealey Plaza, nor would it have built Cleveland Shoreway, which was, at least according to Wikipedia, not always a reliable source, the largest WPA project in the country. All the deficit hawks know how to do is cut, cut, cut. The concept of trimming areas of the federal budget and prioritizing others seems lost on them. What about federal spending that creates new construction jobs? What about public works that also upgrade the public realm? Somebody needs to press these people, especially now that we're in a presidential campaign. Are they really in favor of continuing to let our infrastructure and with it, our future, fall apart? And so, our architectural tour the last decade ends smack dab in the present and its contentious political debate. In other words, it ends tellingly, but inconclusively. This much we know. In buildings like Disney Hall in Los Angeles and in public spaces like Millennium Park, we achieve great things in these years. It's true that the current intellectual fashion in the wake of the 2008 crash has some critics lumping together the masterpieces and the mediocrities of these years under the facile rubric, the decade of excess. Yet I suspect that that line of thinking will prove as short-sighted as the attempts to dismiss the exuberant Art Deco architecture of the 1920s after the stock market crash of 1929. Louis Mumford, a great American architecture critic, famously attacked the Chrysler Building for its inane romanticism and meaningless voluptuousness. The Empire State Building, bereft of tenants during the Depression, was mocked as the empty state building. But as the lyric about Rockefeller Center goes, who's got the last laugh now? Art endures, and the character of the work matters more than the foibles of the era that produced it. And yet, it's also true that we made great mistakes during these years. We reacted clumsily to the terrorist threat at our airports and our public buildings. We promoted a building boom that dragged down the economy and left us with a legacy of bloated generic buildings. And we overemphasized icon buildings designed by celebrity architects to the exclusion of simpler background buildings, and our collective fate is embodied by our failing infrastructure. So what we've seen then on our architectural tour is an era of extreme oscillation between urban disaster and artistic triumph, between repressive security measures and teeming public spaces, between a building boom and a building bust. This was, in other words, a Dickensian construction zone in which it was simultaneously the best and the worst of times. And there's a twist to this Dickensian story. We began our tour with ruins, and we end the tour with ruins too. But while the first set of ruins at the World Trade Center could be blamed on terrorist fanatics, the second set of ruins, evident in America's vast array of crumbling bridges, rail lines, levees, and subway stations, was a failure of our own making. It was the result not of violence, but of our own negligence. Private splendor and public squalor were two sides of the same coin, and they starkly reflected which values had currency in post-millennium America and which did not. The great Chicago architect Louis Sullivan once said, "Our architecture reflects us as truly as a mirror," and never has that observation been truer than in this tumultuous age of terror and wonder. Thank you.
Hello, I'm a student here, a chemist who quietly reads architecture. And my question is, I don't know if you've noticed all the architectural boom here in University Circle with the new MoCA going in, Caddy Corner here, the Seidman Cancer Center across the street, Cleveland Museum of Art. My question is, what is your opinion on the new architecture that's evolving in this area?
So I think if I understood you right, you're asking me what I think about all the new buildings that have gone up here, like the one that isn't finished yet, the new contemporary art building?
Correct.
Yeah, okay. And this is always the interesting thing when you're visiting a city. People want to know, people think that you're like an expert. You've been here for about 3 hours and you're supposed to make a judgment on, I honestly haven't seen the Contemporary Art Museum yet. And so I have to say, I can't say no comment, but I'll say I'll be back next year to review it. Is that?
I'll ask the same question then next year. Thank you.
Okay, all right, thanks.
There seems to be some movement of people moving back to center cities in the United States. Some cities have done that better than others. What do you think the future holds for that movement? Do you think it will continue?
Okay, did everybody hear the question? Or is the center city movement going to continue? I think it will, but I think it's important that we keep it in context. The country is becoming increasingly suburbanized, and I think that architecture critics and urban designers ignore that at their peril. You know, that's the reality that many people have, and it's important that we focus on that. Nevertheless, to come back to your question, the big issue, I think, both in American cities and cities around the world, is what I call urbanization without urbanity. That's what I was trying to show in the slides of those god-awful parking garage high-rises in Chicago. I mean, these are buildings that create density, which is what makes cities hum and is good, but they don't give us delight. They don't create human scale. They deaden the city rather, or they enliven the city and deaden it at the same time. So this is a global issue. I mean, I think we're seeing increasingly the trend of the megacity, the sprawling expanse in Karachi, Pakistan, or other places where we don't have order, delight, beauty, all the things that Daniel Burnham tried to give Chicago and Cleveland and Washington, D.C. I'm not necessarily in favor of bringing back Daniel Burnham's Beaux-Arts approach that you see in your, what is it, the public square area downtown, right? But I do think that we need to, think more deeply about this trend of urbanization and to try to include urbanity, places for people to gather. And Millennium Park is probably one of the better new examples. If you happen to have a lot of money in the pockets of a lot of donors from a tech boom. So maybe it's not the best model. But the trend of creating urbanity, I think, is the key issue as people move back to cities.
Thank you very much for your talk. I really enjoyed it, and particularly also the pictures that you showed. I was interested in getting a firmer idea from you about the two contrasting images that you had, the ruins caused by the terrorist attacks of 9/11 than the ruined building that you showed in the end. Now, your talk was not showing us that much about this destroyed, of the things that we do have that we do not take care of, but isn't then this concentration on those not taking part in this whole iconic idea of concentrating on few things, whereas we let the rest go? And doesn't that then, in some sense, actually overall lead to some demise? I mean, how can we change this attitude really and maybe get people more aware of this?
Well, I think you're asking a great question, and it's really a question about the relentless focus of the media and everyone concerned with architecture on icons and starchitects. I mean, a lot of cities after Bilbao and the Guggenheim Bilbao mistakenly thought that one building alone could be a silver bullet that would revitalize their city. And they didn't realize that Bilbao rebuilt its infrastructure, as well as bringing Frank Gehry in to design that fabulous building. Santiago Calatrava redid their airport. Norman Foster redid their subway system. There was new construction in every possible way. So it wasn't just, the object, it was the spaces in between that were redone. And I think that really gets to the heart of what we've missed out on, which is a discussion of infrastructure. And the country really saw the risk of that and the consequences of that when the levees broke in New Orleans. And I think that's why Barack Obama tried to make rebuilding infrastructure an important part of his campaign. He wanted to do what Franklin Roosevelt did, which was rebuild, create an infrastructure for the 21st century. To me, it's amazing that that's just utterly disappeared now. I mean, unfortunately, you don't hear any of the candidates talking about that. It's all about other things. So, to me at least, I rarely praise other architecture critics, but I mean, I'm particularly pleased that the new architecture critic of the New York Times, Michael Kimmelman, has said, exactly the same thing, that we need to focus on infrastructure, public spaces. So Michael, went out and rode with the bike czar in New York the other day, and took a walk in the South Bronx with the city planning czar. That's great. I mean, in Manhattan, there's more to New York than Manhattan, and there's more to architecture than starchitects. So I think that you pose the question exactly the right way. We have to think about the whole of the built environment, not just the buildings that are going to go in the history books or the architectural magazines.
In which Chicago neighborhood is the Net Zero building?
The Net Zero building is in Ravenswood. It's just off the, this is a north side neighborhood that's just off the metro tracks.
Right, about 4,000 north or so. Do you think this is a sustainable sort of option for the future? Do you think there are going to be many people doing this, as you find in Northern and Western Europe? There's a lot of communities which pride themselves on having solar panels on every house and that kind of thing in the Netherlands. Or
I think that never underestimate the power of technology to change our lives. This afternoon I read over my review of the Lewis building, and I sort of remarked then in 2002 that this building was amazing because it had a wireless capability that allowed students to move around with their laptops wherever they wanted to go. Like 9 years ago, that was cool, and now we take it for granted. So I think that solar, as long as the solar industry can prove that you can recoup the higher first cost that solar panels and other solar energy saving devices will become far more widespread. They've certainly made a great leap forward in the last 10 years, so I'm eager to see where they are 10 years from now.
Might you summarize for us successes and failures, lessons maybe, of building on Chicago's lakefront? 20 years, 30 years.
When you say building, you mean building along the lakefront or on the lakefront?
Building along or not.
Okay. Well, successes and failures. So Okay, well, the successes include Millennium Park, which is a new paradigm for urban parkland. It's different from the Olmstedian Park, which is a naturalistic respite from industrial age society. Millennium Park is, with its large objects, it's more crowded together, it's more interactive, it's a very different sort of urban space than Central Park, say. In terms of failures, I don't know if you're egging me on to talk about Soldier Field, but that was, as many of you know, Beaux-Arts Stadium, and at Mayor Daley's, with Mayor Daley's encouragement and with the Chicago Bears financing, half of the cost, a modern seating bowl, an asymmetrical seating bowl, was put inside these two colonnades. I have called it the eyesore on Lakeshore. Starship Enterprise crash landed on the Parthenon. It does have some fans, but the National Park Service stripped it of its National Historic Landmark status. It's probably an instance of a building that should never have been there. You know, the interior is a wonderful place to watch a game, but it's just a building that's too big for its site, and and really should have been built off the lakefront, not on the lakefront. So those are probably two poles of lakefront good and lakefront bad. Yeah.
Yeah, I have a question, and you talk about the increase and swell of suburbanization. I'm sensing a trend and a yearning that's somewhat opposite to that. I find the process of suburbanization has been one of disconnection from one another, from loss of community, loss of different kinds of people living in the same sort of, in a proximity to one another. And I'm sensing a real yearning to what may be a return to community, not that has existed perhaps in my lifetime, but kind of the way we believe we used to live. And I see that reflected in also, or maybe hand in hand with the desire to be more sustainable, more green, perhaps to live smaller, and yet have larger shared public and community spaces, spaces where we're able to pursue our growing love, at least in this city, of local food production. I'm wondering if you're nodding as though you may be sensing some of that, where you think that might take architecture in the next 10 years.
Okay, good question. I sense that, and yet I do sense, and that's a trend that people have called the new localism. You know, globalism was very much in vogue in the boom years, and now people are sort of, you know, thinking about eating local and shopping local and living local. At the same, and I think that's trend is likely to manifest itself. It already has manifested itself in a desire in the new urbanist desire to create, you know, communities that are more dense, that encourage sociability, that have put an emphasis on public spaces and not just the privacy of the public realm. At the same time, I think that it would be wrong to dismiss the suburbanization that's occurred, and to say that that the physical form of sprawl precludes the formation of community. Physical space isn't the only way to have community. You can have community in a church, you can have community at a baseball field or a soccer field. You may drive to, you know, to your community. Herbert Gans, the great sociologist, once attacked Jane Jacobs, the great urbanist, for kind of prescribing how we should live in terms of, you know, we should all live like Greenwich Village. Well, not you know, the whole world isn't like Greenwich Village. The whole world may be more like Naperville, Illinois, or something like that. You know, sprawling suburb that also has a town center in it. So, well, I think you're right. As I said earlier, I would not ignore the reality of sprawl, of what is often dismissively called sprawl. And I don't think we're going to roll it back and make it disappear. It's a reality. And what I've tried to talk about tonight is dealing with reality. These were realities that I showed you in the video and tried to put in context. And I think that my job is to not just think about theory, but it's to think about what's actually out there in all of the built environment and how it reflects and affects what we do, and how we can make it, and try to do better with our architecture, either for better or for worse. So that's probably a good place to end. So anyway, thank you all very much for your attention.